All right, so I do want to kind of transition into looking at the evidence then, right? We've kind of described what is the resurrection, where does it come from, and that sort of thing from a Jewish perspective. But in terms of evidence, so I want to first ask you, another scholar, Dr. N.T. Wright, he wrote like a 700-page book on the resurrection. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but
Yep.
he talks about the seven mutations. So that these are things that they're dramatic mutations of belief from the prior Jewish belief to what the early Christians were actually teaching. And I just want to highlight about three of them to kind of get your take and see, do you think that these are good evidence that these are such dramatic mutations that it would require an actual resurrection to explain them? So the first would be, as you've hinted at already, the timing of the resurrection changes, right? So they had this concept of a general resurrection. That's everybody at once at the end of time when God will judge the earth and that sort of thing. But the Christians had this somewhat from a Jewish perspective, awkward view of, well, no, the first Jesus and then the general resurrection. Um, there is also, secondly, there's a new concept of resurrection. That resurrection is tied to this notion of being born again, of being saved and in right standing towards God. And then third and finally, the Jewish people thought that the Messiah was not supposed to die altogether. That's utterly foreign from a first century Jewish perspective. But now all of a sudden the Christians are running around and they're tying this resurrection to the death and resurrection to the concept of the Messiah. Um, so yeah, what do you make of some of those mutations? Why didn't Jesus followers just abandon Jesus right away and that sort of thing?
Yeah, you may have to remind me of these as we go through them because that was three different ones. And
Sure.
I'm glad you didn't give me all seven of them, um, but yeah, I mean there were other movements where the leaders, the messianic type movements, where the leaders actually often promised to sign and didn't fulfill it and got killed, and their movements dispersed, as Gamaliel points out in Acts chapter 5, but as is also evident from Josephus and other sources. I mean, the movements didn't outlast their leader. Um, there were revolutionary movements in general that continued to be revolutionary movements, but they weren't built around the earlier leader, and they uh, they fell apart or um, escalated into the Judean-Roman War that was devastating for Judea. Um, anyway, so Jesus' movement is quite different in that. I mean, the others didn't come up with the like, oh wow, our leader actually came back from the dead. Well, where is he? Well, he went to heaven. Oh well, lots of people go to heaven. No, no, I mean he rose from the dead bodily and then went to heaven. It's like, what? Why are you saying that doesn't make any sense? So those weren't things that were normally believed, and it made no sense for the Christians to make that up. It didn't fit any existing paradigms that the Messiah would rise ahead of everybody else. Now, looking back in the Old Testament, you can see it in retrospect based on what happened. So like Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And then he talks about what will happen afterwards. So that he's exalted for a time until the enemies are put down, or the analogies with the Exodus narrative, where God brought his people out, but then there's a delay through disobedience for 40 years before they enter their inheritance. And so we've got things like that. But uh, all that to say, that was a very different permutation. And I'm trying to think what was
Well, one was the another one
next.
was the timing, right? You've kind of hinted at this
Oh yeah,
yourself.
yeah,
So the everyone thinking the general resurrection is where everybody, and now all of a sudden Christians are saying, well, no, there's the Messiah. He would rise singularly first as the
right.
first fruits. Yeah, how could that come about naturally? Yeah.
Yeah, only if they're looking back to it as if having, this is their experience, and so now they're saying, oh, this fits the eschatological resurrection. But and again, they're not going to be able to say it if Jesus just appeared and then collapsed again, or something like that. Uh, they're the only way they're going to be able to say it is if they saw him and the tomb is empty, because otherwise, obviously, people are going to check the tomb to shut them down, or they themselves surely these kind of things haven't happened before, so surely somebody's going to check. Uh, and so those things together, and especially the multiple independent appearances and appearances to many at one time and so on. It's just
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, so amazing. Okay.
easily the best explanation.
I want to ask one last thing, and it's not on that list, but it is something N.T. Wright talks about. But I think it's important. So it's the change in the praxis, the practices. So, for example, from Saturday, that's all of a sudden mutated into Sunday worship or something like that. Like, do you think the change in practices of the early church are remarkable, requiring a resurrection compared to previous Jewish practice?
Yeah, I mean the first day of the week was really important to them, uh, and for that reason, the association with the resurrection. I don't I wouldn't say, like, we have sources in the second century and especially later that do speak of Sunday as a new Sabbath. The New Testament doesn't actually speak of Sunday as a new Sabbath, but certainly it was the day of worship and celebrating. And I think that's mentioned even by Pliny in his Epistle to Trajan 1096. He talks about the meeting on early in the morning on a particular day of the week. Um, so that's early second century.
But were you, sorry, you said so there were later second century Jewish texts talking about
No.
Sundays?
Christian texts.
Okay. Okay.
Now there are some later Jewish texts talking about minim or schismatics that had a different view of the Sabbath. But I think a lot of Jewish believers still, Saturday was the Sabbath. Well, sundown Friday, as we would put it, to sundown Saturday was the Sabbath. And that's the way it still is in the New Testament. I mean, everywhere it talks about the Sabbath, that's what it's talking about. But then the first day of the week is a special day of worship. And almost certainly, although I'm reading it back a little bit from Ignatius, but very early second century, almost certainly um, that's what's meant by the Lord's Day is Sunday.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so there is that difference in practice. There was something I was going to
Also circumcision versus baptism as the sign of initiation or something like that, maybe.
baptism. Baptism was already widespread, so I don't know that baptism was a new circumcision. That's something that's debated among New Testament scholars, and sometimes I think we're reading back later understanding back into the New Testament. So I don't know that baptism replaced it um, so much as that spiritual circumcision was enough without the physical circumcision. Because what the prophets had promised with the new covenant, God's going to pour out his spirit on his people. So here are God's eschatological people. They have the spirit. Well, here these Gentiles now are receiving the spirit. What does that mean? It means they've already become part of the eschatological covenant, the end time covenant, even without the physical circumcision, which kind of makes the physical sign of the covenant superfluous if you've got what the covenant is really all about. But the thing I was going to mention earlier about the the death, the significance of the death as well as the resurrection, was to look at you've got the resurrection in Daniel 12, but in Daniel 7 you have the Son of Man
Yeah.
that Jesus refers to. And of course, Son of Man can just mean human being in Aramaic and Hebrew, Baranish and Ben Adam. But he uses it with, like, Son of Man coming on the clouds and so forth, which is clearly an allusion to Daniel 7. So when you look at Daniel 7, the Son of Man, or the human one, comes as a climax like a few other of the visions in Daniel, to previous empires. So before you've got the human one, you've got four beasts. And these four beasts in Daniel 7 represent four empires and their kings. And so the Son of Man is the final empire, the final kingdom, the kingdom of God, and it represents that empire, but also the king in that empire. And then the Son of Man receives worship, which in the language that's used there in Daniel is only properly applicable to a deity. And yet, he's also identified with the suffering saints of the Most High. So God's people are persecuted by the final empire, which by the first century was understood as Rome. They suffer under this final evil empire, but then in 722 they're exalted, like the Son of Man in 713 and 14. I think because of the connection between the king and the kingdom there, that it also implies that the Son of Man, the king, the one who's going to receive worship, who's divine as well as linked with God's people, he suffers with them under the horn, under the evil empire, before he's exalted. So that it doesn't break it out into like him doing it before them or anything like that. For that, I go to Psalm 110 or some other text. But the idea is, it's already there that the Son of Man, who's going to reign, also would suffer. And you see this connection made in the Gospels. It also shows us the collective character of it, how God's people do suffer in this age, but just as Jesus suffered and was resurrected, he actually suffered under that final evil empire under Rome. We also will be resurrected with him. He's the forerunner for the rest of us. So it makes sense in retrospect. Once the disciples experience what they experienced, then they could go back and put things together based on what Jesus said about the Old Testament.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's how it kind of works for a lot of typologies or type arguments, right? It makes sense in retrospect, looking back. Like, when you see it like straight on, like, no, I can't see it. What are you talking about? But then when you look at it from just such an angle, it clicks. And oh, okay, now I see it. So yeah, I totally get what you're saying there. So
And
okay.
speaking of Daniel and speaking of mysteries, the New Testament use of mystery, um, Daniel actually speaks of the mystery of the kingdom, and the final kingdom that in Daniel chapter 2, around verse 44 and 47, stuff like that. So all that to say, it's already there. The raw material was there in the Old Testament.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, Daniel's one of my favorites there. So okay, okay. So going on with the evidence then, I'm kind of curious. So what is some of the best biblical evidence that we have for Jesus' death and resurrection? And I'm curious what you might make of appeal to some of the pre-New Testament oral traditions. Do you think that's some great evidence as well?
The fact that Paul can take for granted that all Christians already believe in the resurrection suggests that there must have been some pre-written belief about it, obviously.
Yeah.
And again, in Paul's earliest letter, well, earliest or second earliest, First Thessalonians, he talks about it. But the strongest, where he delineates it most fully, is in 1 Corinthians 15. Oh, and there's also all this other stuff that goes along with it. The availability of the Spirit, the churches, like what made me think of it is 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, right before it, where it's talking about people prophesying, and may all prophesy one by one. That's Joel, the Spirit is poured out in all flesh. That's not normal anywhere else in the ancient world, to have that kind of collective prophetic spirit. The closest you've got is Qumran, and it doesn't come close. So um, the consummation isn't yet, but something definitely has changed in history. And Peter points that out in Acts 2, and it's all over the place in the New Testament. But anyway, coming back to 1 Corinthians 15, I hope you pardon me. I'm ADHD, so I'm all over the place. And
Oh, no, no, this is great.
organization is my problem. It's not the information, but First
No, this is
Corinthians
great.
15, he actually is citing earlier witnesses, going way back to the beginning, as almost everybody agrees. In the first few verses, he says, "This is the gospel. Um, this is what I mean by the gospel. Jesus died according to the scriptures, was buried, was raised according to the scripture, raised on the third day according to the scriptures." And there he's dealing with, so there's a backstory to it in the scriptures. And the burial clearly shows he's talking about, something bodily. And yet when he condenses it, this is the condensed form of it. The other condensed form of it he gives of defining the gospel in Romans chapter 1 is Jesus, son of David, according to the flesh, but raised by the Spirit of holiness, according to God's power. So resurrection is, just like in the speeches in Acts, it's like right there at the heart of the gospel. So right from the beginning. And he also says, whether it was they, the other apostles, or me, you heard it from, this is the gospel. So same message being preached by all of them from the beginning. And he names many of the early witnesses, leaves out the earliest witnesses, the women at the tomb, which almost everybody also agrees that the Gospels were correct on that, because who's going to make that up? But, in official lists of witnesses in that period, both in Jewish sources and what we gather from Roman law, the witness of women was rather diminished. Obviously, God didn't think so, since they were the first witnesses he gave. But for the sake of the public testimony, when they're boiling it down, Paul lists people who saw Jesus alive from the dead, then lists himself last of all. And for Paul, it was utterly transformative experience, going from a persecutor to a believer. And I didn't actually persecute people like trying to get them killed, but I certainly made fun of Christians a lot before I was a believer. So
That
anyway,
atheist. Yeah, you were great. I don't know if you mentioned in the last show you were on, you were a hardcore atheist and that
yeah,
sort of thing for a while. So
I,
yeah,
I wasn't I wasn't impervious to evidence. If somebody had given me evidence, I just didn't think there was any. But if somebody had given me some, I think I would have considered it. But I was pretty dogmatic in that I was, they're nice atheists, but I was not one of them. I made
yeah,
fun of Christians. But
no problem. Well, hey, we all got to start somewhere. So no worries. So yeah, so that's great. Now I do have a follow-up here that I know you're excited, and I'm actually excited to hear about. I want to ask you, okay, great. You've talked about some of the biblical evidences and some of these pre-New Testament oral traditions. What about archaeology? Do we have any good archaeological evidences supporting the evidence for the resurrection? For example, I've heard about this thing called the Nazareth Decree, and I know you've done some research on the Holy Sepulchre, the Golgotha site there. So, what do you make of these archaeological discoveries?
the the Nazareth inscription is more debatable, uh, in that it may just be in Nazareth by, well, I don't know if it'd be there by accident. It is kind of a coincidence, um, but I think where I can speak more authoritatively is the Holy Sepulchre, because I think there's really strong evidence there. So how would the site have been remembered? Well, how would it not have been remembered? You know, Joseph of Arimathea, there's good evidence. I mean, who's going to make up like somebody from Arimathea? What's Arimathea? Probably Ramathaim Zophim, but I mean, who's going to, so anyway, but, um, and actually when they were upset with the Sanhedrin, who's going to make up a nice Sanhedrist? And, if he's going to bodies did have to be buried. That was Josephus tells us Judeans required that, but they could be buried in a pit or a common criminal's grave. They had to be kept separate so that a year later the families could come and get the bones. Um, but uh, but Joseph wants uh, this body. He's not asking for the other bodies. He's kind of nervous as he comes and asks Pilate because, well, I'm going into too much detail. I need to stop that. It's because I'm writing a commentary on Mark right now, so I'm really into the gospel narrative. But just cutting to the quick in terms of where the site is and how it would have been remembered. The early Christians certainly would have remembered it. The enemies of the early Christians would have certainly wanted to check it if they're going to contest with them about it. And also, when Jerusalem's destroyed, it didn't mean that everything was destroyed. I mean, we still have the archaeological evidence, but and then when Hadrian was destroying places, Hadrian, that was one of the sites he desecrated because it was still being regarded as a sacred site by people. So the tradition goes back before Hadrian, but we also know it goes back well before then because everybody knew that burials had to be outside of Jerusalem. But in the years 41 to 44, King Herod Agrippa I extended the walls of Jerusalem, the third wall. The site is inside that third wall, which means that nobody would say, okay, somebody's buried here because it's inside the third wall. But at the time that Jesus was crucified, around the year 30, or some people would say 33, that was outside the walls of Jerusalem, it was outside the second wall. The third wall was built, like if we date Jesus' crucifixion around the year 30, the third wall was built within 14 years of that. So the memory of that site would seem to go back to within 14 years. So earlier than Paul's letters, earlier than First Corinthians. And when they dug down in the time of Constantine, because of this persistent belief of people in the local area, this was the right site, they find that there are tombs in the area. Well, I don't think they knew the difference between a tomb from this century and a tomb from that century. But today, archaeologists do, and archaeologists verify that beneath the Holy Sepulchre is a first century tomb. And that area has first century tombs. And it can't be later than the first century again, because after after the year 44, nobody was burying anybody there anyway.
Yeah, I think that this is fascinating to me. I think so. You're talking about, look, this has been excavated by a couple of archaeologists, Dr. Shimon Gibson, as well, Joan E. Taylor, and she makes this argument that she was a skeptic. She didn't believe in this site. Now she's a committed believer that this is true based on the archaeological evidence. And I just want to highlight that point you made about the excavations, which would have been impossible for later Christians, say in the time of Constantine or second century. They wouldn't have known about this area, which corresponds precisely to the Gospels and was obliterated in 44 AD when they did this excavation. And so one thing you missed is I understand from the archaeology they've also proven there was a garden in this
Yeah,
area as well.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that
which fits. Yeah, yeah,
awesome.
and yeah, it was the site of an ancient quarry. Anyway, that's not. Yeah, but later used as a garden, and yeah, well, there's so much we could say about it. But
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. All right. So far you've kind of talked a little bit about the empty tomb and the appearances and that sort of thing. And you did hint at Paul in one of your earlier answers. I want to kind of focus on what is your take on James and Paul? Is there good biblical evidence that these two were actually skeptics at the time of their conversions or prior to their conversions. And if it is true that they are zealous skeptics, is this phenomenon unique in the ancient world, or are there natural explanations where, yeah, hardened skeptics do actually change and turn around or something like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, throughout history, a hardened skeptic of anything can, won't always, but can turn around in the face of considerable evidence. Um, but that's what we're talking about here is considerable evidence. It's like when I was converted from atheism, uh, I still had all sorts of obviously intellectual questions afterwards because I didn't get them all answered right there on the spot. But um, I was an atheist, and then people shared with me the gospel, and then I argued with them for 45 minutes. Wasn't convinced by what they said, but I had an encounter with God, and like, He's not letting me alone. And I'm like, okay, well, it's kind of hard to be an atheist with God in the room with me. So, but I know that doesn't count for other people because that's just your experience. But anyway, in the case of James, Jesus' brothers weren't believing in him in John chapter 7, um, but especially in Mark. Uh, and Mark really goes after him. I mean, Mark chapter 3, the disciples are bumbling idiots like a lot of us. And then Jesus' brothers actually think he's nuts. So they think he's out of his mind. Literally, the wording means stands outside of himself. In the next chapter, they're the ones standing outside. He can't get in because of the crowds. Um, Mark has a little play on words there, I think, but it's in the same context as the some of the scribes who are saying that Jesus is possessed by Beelzebul, and insanity was sometimes linked with being possessed by a spirit in ancient thought. So, like, his brothers are probably thinking, okay, these people they want to take him out, and he could actually be stoned as a false prophet if it's a false spirit speaking through him, if that's what others think. We think he's just nuts. So we want to take custody of him. That's not a very flattering picture of his brothers or his mother for that matter. And uh, not unanimously, but most scholars think that the criterion of embarrassment here, since these were later leaders in the church, as were certainly the disciples, and we know these were later leaders in the church, Galatians chapter 1 and 2 in particular, and 1 Corinthians 15 and Acts chapter 1, uh, and I'm sorry, Acts chapter 12. But anyway, um, these were later leaders in the church presented in a very unflattering way. The criterion of embarrassment suggests that actually these were things that actually happened. And later leaders are like, yeah, I wasn't quite on board when all this started. I had to learn the hard way. Well, so that's not as strong an evidence, though, as with Paul, because with Paul, you've got Paul himself saying he persecuted the Christians. That's not going to gain him any browning points with the Christians to whom he's writing. And, he's being persecuted for his faith now. So, it's obviously didn't earn him any brownie points to be converted, especially when he knew what happens to people that he was persecuting, that it could happen to him too. So Paul talks about this in Philippians chapter 3. He talks about it in 1 Corinthians 15. Obviously, Luke talks about it. Um, uh, it's also in 1 Timothy chapter 1. So, yeah, for Paul clearly switched sides and didn't do so for economic benefit.
Okay, so I have three quick follow-ups, if you don't mind. Okay, so the first thing in terms of Mary, let's start there. I find Mary a little bit confusing here, so I'm wondering what your take is because so in the Gospel of Mark, as you're saying, yeah, she along with her brothers thinks Jesus is nuts. What are you doing? Get back here, boy. I gotta rein you in. But then in other places, she is believing. Like in the Gospel of John, she's like this guy's special, like do as he says at the wedding of Cana.
Right.
So like how would you reconcile that? Like why is she skeptical in one place early on, but then she's also believing? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even in Luke 2, she's treasuring these things in her heart. So she knows something, she believes something, but she may be concerned about Jesus getting in too much trouble. And also, Jesus is the eldest brother. So James can't just, I mean, James may be the second eldest, but he can't just like go talk to his elder brother and say, you have to do this. But if he takes his mom along with him, then they've got some bargaining power. And Jesus is able to avoid the issue because the crowd keeps them out. I don't know. Maybe he goes out and talks to them afterwards, but um, his brothers still don't believe in him in John 7, but I think his mother probably had some more. Personally, you know, how you put the evidence together, we've got a lot of gaps in our knowledge. You know, it's 2,000 years later. We can't go back and interview people like Luke did. So um, I'm not a deconstructionist, but I think deconstructionists rightly pointed out that any narrative you have is incomplete. There are going to be gaps in the text. And so when you know, even interview eyewitnesses, or even my wife, she was a war refugee in Congo where she's from. And so after after she got out, when we were engaged at that point, after she got out of the war, she would share with me her stories. I would write them down. And later I had access to her journal. And at some points, I would find things that I thought were contradictions. So, like, okay, here you told me it was a plastic container, but there in your journal, you said it was a bottle. So, which is it? Like, okay, I mean, with memory, we don't expect like complete,
Precisely.
but but because I was able to ask her, I was able to get an answer. She said, yeah, the plastic container was a plastic bottle. Duh. I'm like, oh, I didn't think of that. So, some of
Yeah.
the things we think are contradictions aren't. But when we're at this remove, we just speculate how they fit together. We can't go back and interview people to see how they fit together. So um, that's true with any historical source where we have limited information. We can't answer every possible question, but we can make plausible guesses about, well, this can fit this in this way.
And there is an interesting comparison between Mary, the mother of Jesus, and James, Jesus' brother, because
Mhm.
I've heard Gary Habermas make this argument about, well, look, Mary's at the foot of the cross, so indicating she's a believer at that point and stuff like that. Whereas none of the brothers of Jesus are there. James isn't at the cross, indicating they're probably still skeptical at this point. I don't know if you seem a little bit skeptical yourself of that argument, or
Well, Mary wouldn't even have to be following with the group if she's in Jerusalem for the Passover. I mean, she would be most likely in Jerusalem for the Passover. So would Jesus' brothers. If she, you know, it takes time to die on the cross. So by the time Jesus is dying on the cross, Mary would have gotten word of it, and it would make sense for her to come. As far as male followers and male relatives, they had more to lose. They were more likely to be detained. Not that Pilate really was interested in doing that, but they, it, the risk was higher. Now, of course, I believe the beloved disciple was there. He says he was there, um, and I believe that. Um, but I think it may have also had something to do with, you know, who was in greater danger. Now, having said that, and talking about reconciling the stories, um, John Wyndham uh, did harmonization. Mike Licona has shown how things can fit together with spotlighting and so on. But as Gary Habermas pointed out to Mike Licona and to all the rest of us with his minimal facts argument, you don't have to have all those things figured out. You don't even have to have all the details be true. I mean, not saying that they're not, but you don't have to have that. Christianity doesn't rise or fall on this detail or that detail. Rises or falls on whether Jesus rose from the dead. And when you've got a bunch of different sources, like E.P. Sanders, who was my, he was on, he, I was his TA at Duke.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. Yeah.
yeah, E.P. Sanders, at one point he says, well, it's not surprising, some parts of the Gospels, you've got the story going just along, pretty much in all three or four versions. But uh, when you come to the resurrection narrative, you've got a bunch of different ones because it's like this person, I saw him first. No, I saw him first. You've got different witnesses, multiple witnesses who all want to tell this story. So um, the important thing is that they all saw him alive from the dead. So whatever the details, in I like Mike's way of going at it, Mike Licona's way of going at it, but
Yeah.
whatever the details, Jesus rose from the dead, and that's the game changer.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mike has a great way of phrasing that kind of thing. So yeah, I like that. So okay, my last follow-up question on this is Paul, and I just want to briefly get your take because you will be aware. So like when we're looking at biblical evidence, I think it's crystal clear Paul is zealous for the traditions of his ancestors and the Jewish way, and he's zealous in his persecution of Christians. He hates them. He thinks they're blasphemers and all this. But skeptics seem to bring in, oh no, what Paul really had doubts. He was conflicted. He was experiencing cognitive dissonance and inner turmoil. What do you think of that? Is there any basis for something like that?
That's not what Paul says. I mean, he says, I was righteous according to the law, Philippians chapter 3, and goes on to list his qualifications. People sometimes go to Romans 7, but Romans 7, he's speaking of life under the law, and he's speaking of it retroactively from a Christian perspective. It's not talking about a psychological disturbance before his conversion. Yeah, there have been people who have tried to do psychoanalysis on Paul. I mean, it's hard enough with a living person, but with somebody who's been dead for a couple thousand years and you can't interview them, you don't know about their early home life, the relationship with their dad, all that stuff. Um, it's just totally speculative. It doesn't fit the evidence that we do have. Um, he was still persecuting them up until the time, and he was pretty shocked. Again, the evidence that we do have in Acts chapter 9, he goes without eating or drinking for 3 days. Eating for 3 days, actually, some of us could probably afford that, but uh, you can't go for much more than, after 3 days, you're going to start doing kidney damage if you keep it up too long in a dry climate. So um, it was pretty sudden, pretty radical. And of course, I would assume he still had questions to resolve. Sociological studies of conversion in the Western world often show how people are socialized into it for a time. But with adult converts, sometimes there is a sudden conversion. It was that case with me. And again, I had a whole lot of catching up to do. The little kids in Sunday school knew more about the Bible than I did. I was completely unchurched. But uh, Paul, he had the Torah, he had the prophets, he had the background, but seeing how it fit together, his worldview was turned upside down.
Great. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker. And what am I doing? This isn't an intro. This is an ending. So this is an outro. So yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed part 2 of the interview I did with Dr. Craig Keener, where we looked at the positive resurrection evidence, the evidence in favor of Jesus' resurrection. And it was a great interview. We're about halfway done, my full interview with Craig. So I'm going to continue to keep my promise to Craig and post this up in little bite-sized chunks. We've got about two more chunks to do. So this one was on the first one. First episode was on the what is the resurrection in general? What does that belief entail, and how does it relate to pagan and Jewish ideologies or teachings about life after death and the resurrection in particular? This one was on the what is the evidence for Jesus's resurrection? And next week, the third chunk, the third of the four bits, will be on skeptical objections to the resurrection, looking at things like resurrection contradictions and stuff like that. And then finally, the fourth and final part will be an ending to the series. We're going to ask him about various naturalistic explanations, why they fail compared to the resurrection hypothesis. What he thinks about David Hume's objection to miracles in general and how we identify them. And of course, because I'm pro Shroudy and I'm the founder of the Shroud Wars, I asked Craig what his take on the Shroud of Turin is. So tune into that. This scholar's scholar. What does he make about the evidence for the Shroud of Turin? Does he think it's authentic, or does he think it's a medieval hoax? Or does he have another opinion like David Falk? Yeah, tune in for that to see what Craig's answer is. All right, guys, have a great week. Take care.